We'll kickstart today with a talk by Robin. Robin is associate professor at IISER Tirupati, and he also has spent many, many years thinking about birds that live in montane habitats, slightly higher elevation habitats in the Western Ghats. So, Robin, great to have you.
Thanks, Uma and Ansil and Farah for getting me here. It's great to be here. It's on, yeah. I just want to first qualify by saying that a lot of my disease ecology connections come from others in the room, that is Guha and Farah and Ashwin, who we are kind of co-supervising. So since Ashwin's going to be talking in just a little while, I thought what I'd do is set the stage a little bit by talking about biogeography itself. I'll give you a little bit of introduction about broad biogeographic principles, just continuing on with some of the theoretical ideas that you've been exposed to. I'll kind of try and add a little bit more in terms of biogeography. I'm not talking about disease itself like some of the others earlier, but I think you'll see very soon that all of these ideas are very much applicable to disease also. Yeah. So the first thing is that I work mostly in these montane habitats, the mountain tops in the Western Ghats, and they are called sky islands because they are habitats that are separated from each other. The tops of the mountains are separated by from each other by valleys. And on the tops of these mountains, you get such habitats, which is forests and grasslands. Both are natural mosaics in this habitat. I also want to, sorry, this is not showing up really well. I want to say that, so I'm from IISER Tirupati, which is a fairly new institution. And we get about 200 undergraduates each year, which is about what we call the BSMS, Integrated Masters Program. But we also have IPhD, PhD, and postdoc, about 200 or so. And so IISERs are just like the IITs set up by an act of parliament and so on. So there's a lot of other kinds of research that happens here. In ecology, there are two groups. I mean, I focus in the Western Ghats largely and associated, spreading out a little bit from there. And my colleague Nandini works in the Ladakh landscape and some other areas looking at small mammals. And my group itself works on 4 different themes. Research is basically landscape ecology, bird evolution and biogeography, which is what I'm going to kind of touch upon today. Actually, not so much about my research itself. And then in the evening, I'll talk to you a little bit about bioacoustics and behavior, because it looked like there was a lot of interest in bioacoustics. So I'm trying to kind of synthesize a lot of different threads of research. That will be later this evening. And we have quite a few people in the group, some of who are here as well. So biogeography, I have to first acknowledge that a lot of the theoretical initial slides come from Guha, and a lot of the introductory work was done when I was in Uma's group, and a lot of the recent work comes from what I've learned from Naman, who's my PhD student working on many aspects of biogeography. So I want to stress, the role of natural history, especially in biogeography, because if you think about it, we often like to think that science is done in a very experimental framework, but biogeography itself, started probably, you could say, with early natural history, descriptions, including from what Darwin and Wallace, I mean, what they were doing was looking at these interactions with environment. I mean, you may have seen yesterday, people modeling some things like this with different variables. But what these people were doing was they were building kind of, models that were not explicit in mathematically, but they were kind of verbal models. So I would say that biogeography has its roots in natural history, and that is what kind of links to modern science today. It's a very valuable part, because if you don't, I mean, this is, I think, what is happening with a lot of disease work as well today. because it's not like you can suddenly jump in and start doing, very high-end research on certain virus or bacteria or whatever, because you first need to understand them. You need to kind of observe where they are, what they are, and so on. So, and in that process, biogeography actually is a very important part as well. And I really like this slide when talking about biogeography or biodiversity. Can anyone guess what these are? Yeah, okay. So yeah, they are moths, but usually there is some butterfly answer. So, and which is fine, I mean, sometimes you can't tell. But what's more interesting is, so I'll tell you what this is. This is, as you can guess, it's a big sheet, like a bed sheet, tied in forest in Eagle Nest. You heard yesterday from Umesh, yeah, so you know where Eagle Nest is, by the scientist Ramana Atreya at ICER Pune. So, can you guess how many species are there? Wild guess. 100. Any other number? 300? So, so when I asked Ramana, I said, I'm going to put up this slide. Can you tell me how many species are there? And he said, who knows? So the answer is really not clear. So the point of what I was trying to say is, so he says it can be anywhere up to 2,000 as well, because there are some really small, moths there. I mean, that's the kind of diversity that they see in one place. And you can imagine what is known and what is unknown. And this is very much like your, like your disease, like that topic as well, right? Because there are many things that are discovered, but there are so many more which are not known. But anyway, we now know that some of the factors that play a very important role is biotic and abiotic and biotic. I mean, you know this stuff. This is from school. And we were talking about a lot of these things yesterday, and I think also day before yesterday. For example, species ranges. And that is immediately, like, everybody is curious, why are species distributed in very peculiar manner? Very few species are actually found all across. So what makes it like this? And Umesh talked about it. Divya also mentioned some things about it. And here's a great textbook example of kangaroos. Yeah. So can someone summarize from this slide what do you think is happening? Yeah, it's fairly simple, right? It's not a complicated. Read the legend. Make sure to get the legend.
So they majorly talk about. Yeah, so they majorly talk about that kangaroos are mostly found in a particular climatic condition.
Yeah.
Rather, the entire area, some are wet and some are very moist, and that is not suitable for them.
Yeah.
So you find a higher concentration in arid landscapes.
Yeah. So thank you. That's a great summary. So the main thing here is that this is of one species, and it's for numbers of individuals of that species. So it's the density, and you can see how the density changes depending on certain climatic factors. At least that's what they are saying. So you can also see that there is an upper boundary, outer boundary for the species distribution. So there are some parts where the species itself is not found. Yeah, and they have a proposal of why, they have a suggestion why that may be so. So this is to kind of highlight that although you see species distribution, these big maps, but obviously not all species occur at the same densities all through its through the that area that's projected. So let me give you another example. Do you all know this species? Yeah, so this is the leopard cat. Of course, I left the name there. I should not have, but yeah. So leopard cat is a small cat found in India, different parts. And some researchers, Shomita Mukherjee and others, when they were working in Uma's lab actually, had this really interesting paper. And I use it in almost all my biodiversity, biogeography talks. So these are the locations where these leopard cats are found. Yeah. And again, if you read the legend, this is the temperature. Yeah. So can you come up with some hypothesis now on what's happening? Any guesses?
These species are living in an optimum temperature, not very cold and not very if we see the dots and the temperature.
Yeah.
So the species are not very much available in the hotter environment.
Yeah. So I mean that seems like a very like the simple thing, right? I mean because you're making a connection between where these dots are and what the temperature regime is like. So they don't seem to be found anywhere in this red zone. Yeah. But now, what if I tell you that there's another species called jungle cat, and let's, for the sake of simplicity, say that they are mostly found in this red area. So then, how would you modify your hypothesis then? So you're saying that jungle cat is probably adapted to that other kind of habitat or other climatic regime. Any other possibilities? Competition, right? Yesterday, Umesh talked about this. And how would you then go about testing this? So there are two competing hypotheses, right? I mean, one is that it's actually adapted to the particular climatic regime. Like both are just coincidentally adapted to these climatic regimes. And then of course another is that there is competition. So how do you test this? Yeah. Yeah. There's a point where the incidence of leopard cat, both the species, as per your can come. There is a slight border. Yeah. Probably there we could set up some study area where both the interactions can be commonly found. Yeah. Probably we could track
how often they interact with each other, or what are the durations they go for hunting or go for, foraging or whatever.
Yeah, it's something little bit, that's a great idea. Basically, what he's saying is look at interactions. So can we modify this a little bit? Can we build on this? Can someone else suggest an actual experiment? Molecular genetics, like what, in what framework? What would you do with that?
Like to compare the gene flow between two different species, like comparing.
I see where you're going. That's an interesting idea. But, that actually is...
If you bring about one species to that particular area and then install it, so we can see the interaction, right?
Absolutely. So you're saying, let's move the jungle cat and put it in the leopard cat's area and see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes,
and then
sir.
you can, so translocation kind of an experiment.
Yes,
You could do that other way also, right?
Yes, sir.
You could take one here and the other there. Yeah, that would be a fairly good way to do it. But you know that in reality, for a lot of organisms, I mean, for some organisms, maybe you can do that. But in some cases, you can't do it, right? So that is where a lot of ecologists look at natural experiments. And I'm sure disease ecologists also do the same, because you cannot often actually create infections and create disease to observe what happens. Of course, you can in some cases in lab conditions, but in the natural environment, it's not often possible. Yeah. Yeah.
Can be used for see the interaction between, if the both species is found in that place, that we can see. It's a natural habitat.
Yeah, exactly. So what you do with natural experiments is look for areas where species may occur together, yeah, in a similar environment or something like that. Or you look in places where the climate is similar, but different organisms, kind of different species exist. So basically you try and find ways to control one variable or the other. And then you're looking for areas where this is possible, where you can make your observations. Yeah. Just a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, since we cannot move the cats around,
Yeah.
does it make sense to look at like that functional niche idea, just looking at how they both are using their habitat, and if at all there's a possibility of competition, does that help?
So the problem is that actually that can never get to this true experimental this thing, because you don't know what happens. So what people often ecologists are looking for are systems where due to some other reason a species is not found. For example, on some island or something like that, where you know that the temperature regime is the same, one species is there but not the other. And then you can look at the functional niche, because in the absence of one species, how far is it? So you can't do those Cornell kind of experiments where you remove one species and add species, but you can look for areas where that exists in nature, and this is pretty much what how it works in other systems.
So recently, the Indian government introduced the cheetahs, right?
Yeah,
So to enrich that species, but some of them are not survived there.
Yeah.
So previous lecture, I was in Nehru Plantum. They told that you have to first conserve that savanna regions like that. After that, if you introduce that, it may survive.
Yeah.
Right. So how can a cheetah from another country or region can survive here?
Yeah.
By correlating these things.
Yeah, I don't know if you know the story behind some of the deaths, because they came from the southern hemisphere and they came here, so there was a seasonality shift and so on. Yeah, so definitely I think some of those things would definitely matter. I'm not going into the cheetah. I'm not taking the bait there, but yeah. Distribution density. Yeah.
Distribution density, if you look at one species distribution in cold area.
Yeah.
So where that population itself prevents the entry of the other.
Yeah.
So because of high density of that species.
That's a really good point, because what you're trying to say is that what if it is something like this?
Yeah.
So there is increased
no
competition
space for
in
other
this area.
species to enter.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. I mean, there's fewer individuals here. So that's possible. In different parts of the range, different things could be happening. So what I wanted to kind of point out was that there are these two things that are happening, both at the level of individuals and then at the species level. And then if you think of biodiversity on the whole, it is basically this intersection of these different ranges, right? So every species has a range, and then if you're overlapping different ranges, some places stand out as having many species, right? So the thing about biogeography is that is exactly what it is. Only thing that is that there are some patterns. So has everyone heard of biogeography before? Anyone who's not heard of biogeography before? I mean, it's okay to have not heard of it. Yeah, so maybe most of you have, but can you, this is a really nice, I like this illustration a lot, because it very, very quickly tells you what is meant by biogeography, right? Someone who's not heard of biogeography, can you describe what's happening? Forget about the term. What do you see in the illustration? Okay.
So the distribution of species based on their geographical locations, where we can exactly find the particular species, not somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that particular geographic location is very adaptable to that particular species, where they can reproduce and adapt, survive.
Sure. Yeah. So the cause is a different aspect, but the main thing is that you find some of these patterns, right? You find lions somewhere and elephants somewhere and polar bears somewhere, and so there are these specific patterns in how diversity is distributed across the globe. And that's pretty much what biogeography is, very simply put. And you also know that, remember we were talking about these overlays of ranges. This is a very popular kind of map. I think Uma had it in her first day slides as well. So you can see where diversity is. But then, he alluded to something which is like why something is happening. So you can also ask, why is there higher diversity in some place? And then I'm going to show you this illustration. So this is net primary productivity. And here's the legend again. This is gram carbon per meter square per year. So can someone quickly say what's happening? Yeah, please. Yeah, so I mean, here you are making a jump, but basically you're saying that there are some areas where there is greater primary productivity. Which are those areas?
Mostly the tropics.
Yeah, so there seems to be some kind of, yeah, right? So that's nice. And you can see this in India as well. So here's a blowout of the Indian landscape. Yeah, you can see some of the biodiversity hotspots sticking out. Yeah. Yeah, so the simple way to measure it is by, it's usually the plant material, like how much carbon is there. So it's the, you go, let's say you take a 1 meter square of area, and then you put a plot there, and you take all the plant material from there, stick it in an oven, because it's dried, because you don't want the water, and that is gram carbon per meter square per year. I mean, it has to be converted to the year as well. It's a biomass, yeah. Yeah, please.
Is this done using satellite images or on-site visits?
Actually, I don't remember how this one itself was made. Yeah, but possibly satellite, but there were a lot of reference sites also where people had actual data. Yeah, there are ways that people get to diversity through satellite imagery, derived NDVI, and things like that. That's also possible. So what I wanted to kind of get to was that there may be different kind of parameters that in turn drive the productivity, right? So yesterday we were looking at some variables that I think Umesh was talking about, which is temperature, and then I don't think he talked about rainfall. But you can see how as rainfall increases, you can see how the productivity kind of goes up. And similarly with temperature, there's a slightly different relationship, but that's pretty much the same. Yeah. So what we're trying to say here is that there's biodiversity, there are patterns of biodiversity, and then there may be other factors that kind of come into how that biodiversity is formed, which may ultimately come down to some of these temperature, rainfall kind of parameters. So there are these things called biogeographic zones, which is, if you remember, we were talking about overlaying these species distribution maps, like the different ranges of species. So at some point, some species stop being found and other species start, right? Just like our, the leopard cat and the jungle cat. So if you have, like, let's say 100 such instances, so that becomes a biogeographic barrier. So what scientists have done is that they've looked at different species, various kinds of taxa, and they have classified all of the globe into different biogeographic zones. Yeah? So can you summarize at least what's happening with India? Yeah, it's a hotspot, but what do you think about the, when we are talking about species that are similar or different?
So what area they selected for this thing?
No, this is the global thing. Globally, basically, you look at what species are there, and based on some kind of similarity, group them. Like these are groups of species which are sort of together.
Yeah.
You're saying it's a hot, I don't know.
No.
We just have these, like,
Yeah.
responses.
Yeah, it is a hotspot, but what about the species that are there? Does this say anything about the species that are there? Yeah. Are you moving back to the leopard cat? So, all right, so let's step back a little bit and think about what are biogeographic zones. we said it's basically biodiversity, where how you get diversity is when you overlap different species ranges. So we had the leopard cat, it ended at one particular point. After that is jungle cat, right? So another, let's put like some, I don't know, fishing cat or some other, it's not fishing cat, but some other species, right? So you put another species B, C, D, E, and let's say all of them have the same area where the species boundary ends and another set of species kind of takes over. There's this turnover, right? So that is a biogeographic barrier because it is common to many species. It's not one species that ends there, but multiple species that end there, right? So having understood that, this is done at the global scale. They've taken the range maps, let's say, of many different species, plants, birds, animals, all of that, and then they made this map. So what does it say about India is my question. Yeah.
Species can't cross beyond that place.
Yeah. So
that's why they divided in those regions.
Yeah. So where is that area where species cannot cross in the case of India?
Himalayan range.
Yeah. So there's a turnover there, right? You have the Sino-Japanese, and then on this side you have the Saharo-Arabian. Yeah. But what's surprising is that it's also similar to some other areas. Yeah. Like the Oriental, the other part, right? That's right. So that means that in general, given a very big perspective, a lot of the species are shared with Southeast Asia. Yeah, so this is a big picture view, the global view of how biodiversity is shared. So this is likely to be the same when you're thinking of pathogens and disease as well, because you're going to find some patterns like that maybe the spread of disease, animals, all of them are kind of linked, right? So you have some of these patterns. So this is interesting, but through the talk, I'll also tell you, when you start looking at more detail, you'll find that there are other barriers. For example, our jungle cat thing is not here, right? Yeah, because it's probably very few species that turn over at that point. It's not as many as are there at the Himalayas. Yeah, so let me see. So yeah, here's the Indian biographic zones of India. This was done in 1980s. It's a really nice map which has kind of stood the test of time. Like a lot of people have generated different kinds of data, and somewhat they agree with this. So you can see the Western Ghats, Eastern Ghats, and so on, right? There are different elements there. The legend is here, Central Highlands, and so on. So these are what Indian scientists said form different biogeographic regions, but this was actually based on plant data largely. Yeah. So you can imagine that sometimes it may not match if you're just going by only one taxa. So yeah, we discussed this and we also did this. We don't need to do that. I was wondering if we should, sorry, Uma, I have till 10:30, right? Yeah. Okay. So there's this island, there's this famous, in biogeography, there is this very interesting model which can get a little bit complicated sometimes. And what we'll do is we'll skip through this for now, but if we have time, we'll come back to it. Okay, it's this is island equilibrium model. It's very good for understanding how species colonize and how much diversity you expect to see in isolated kind of populations. But we can come back to that. Anyway, so I think many of you know about Darwin, but probably not as much about Wallace. Any of you read anything about Wallace? Know anything about Wallace's life? Yeah, you have?
Really undermined or just went under the radar. They say the same thing about Wallace and
yeah, that's true. And it's really interesting. And there's this book by David Quammen, Song of the Dodo, that really it provides a very nice description, but I have to warn you that it's a little bit dry. So, so save that for some time when you have a lot of time. But a quick summary is that, yes, of course, he was a contemporary of Darwin. There's a really interesting story. Well, I seem to have missed a slide, but I'll tell you what it is. Wallace, at that time, people used to go to these different unknown areas to document diversity, document different species. And the game was to try and, if you say that you found a new species, you have to get the evidence for it. So you need herbarium or museum specimens or something like that to be taken back to London where the museums were. And there you say someone compares it with all the type specimens and says, yes, this is a different species. Wallace went to Amazon, spent I think about 2 years describing several species, went into remote channels there, different rivers and so on. And then he said, okay, now I have a lot of material. I'm going to describe a lot of different species and so on. So he got on the ship, but the ship sank on the way. And all the material, was lost. But of course, he survived. Then after that, he went back to London and he was depressed. He was like, yeah, I worked so hard, but this is where it is. But he didn't lose hope. He then decided to go to another part of the world, and that was the Southeast Asia, somewhere here. And here, he started making these observations of an area, just like how we were describing, for up to a certain point on some island, you would see the Southeast Asian species. And then just on the other island, neighboring island, you wouldn't see that. You would see more Australasian species, the Australian influence. And that has since been described as the Wallace line. So it's a very big biogeographic zone across which the species kind of turnover happens very, very rapidly. And then since then, there have been other lines described because, as you can imagine, as more species and patterns of distribution emerge, you'll start seeing these biogeographic barriers being described as well. So in some sense, yeah, please.
Why did we get that line? Like, demarcation between
how
two
or why?
Yeah, what was the mechanism behind it?
It's the same way as you draw the biogeographic barriers line, right? Where a species ends. So why that happened is because there is a deep oceanic channel there. Okay, so what happens is that oceans are barriers for species dispersal, but during climatic fluctuations, as ice forms, the oceans recede. So areas that are low-lying will get connected. But if you have a deep channel, they don't get connected. So it turns out that that particular area where Wallace was kind of looking over, that was a very deep channel. So there was not as much connection in the faunal components as much over there.
Okay.
Does that answer the how and the why?
Looking at the map, it looks pretty close by.
Yeah, that's the cool thing about biogeographic barriers. It's not about distance. So that is something else. That is isolation by distance, where you can have a continuous landscape, and then as you go further and further away, you become slightly more different. I have an example later in the evening talk on one of the bird species. So it's not about distance, but it is definitely about some limitation to dispersal. Everybody remembers what dispersal is, right? So that dispersal can be facilitated by other species in case of, vectors and parasites and things like that. But the point is that there is a barrier at some point. Species are not able to cross. Why that is? It can be, in this case, oceanic channel. In some other cases, it can be just climate. Yeah, so it can be, the reasons may be many, or an interaction of a few, but the end result is that there is an effective barrier. And you can measure this with quantifying gene flow, as somebody pointed out. So kind of to summarize this part is we've kind of looked at, in some places, species may be absent because of some limits to its distribution. And it can be because they are inaccessible, or it may be also just because there is insufficient time. Sometimes the limits are due to behavior, different behavioral aspects. And there can be an element of habitat selection. Like there are resources which are found only in one area and not in another. Or it can be these biotic factors that we discussed, competition and so on. And various other abiotic factors, some of which we talked about, temperature and so on. Yeah? So this kind of gives you an idea of how diversity is distributed. And it's a very good starting point to understand and explore some causal mechanisms of what's happening with species. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about India and Indian biogeography. So that's the Indian plate, 150 million years, 100 million years, drifting across and colliding with the Asian plate, about 50 million years. Yeah. And during this time, when it was around at the reunion hotspot, there was a lot of lava flow, and that lasted for a couple of million years. And some parts of the Western Ghats, especially the northern parts of the Western Ghats, the Deccan Plateau, is all a product of that. But the southern Western Ghats is a product of series of uplifts that happened as this Indian plate was kind of traveling up. Uplift is like you have a plate, and then if you hit it from the bottom, there's a little bit of a bulge. So there's a series of uplifts, and you can actually see those series if you look at the profile. The highest parts are the first one, and then you have a plateau, and then you have another, and so on. But the real aspect, that is just geology, you could say. But of course, biogeography is about how the geographical aspects interact with species. And here's a list of different kind of species. So as I was saying, 55 million years, the Asian, there was a scollation. But in that time, there were several Asian elements that moved into India, yeah, from other places. But there are also other species where vicariance or basically isolation has happened because of that drift itself, because of the continental drift. And but one thing to remember is that birds and mammals are relatively new, so you don't see some of these continental drift type of patterns affecting bird differentiation, divergence, and so on. So it's mostly the older ones where you see these effects. Yeah.
So in the genetics of, genes of these, we can obviously see the evolutionary path that they have taken, but can we also study the biogeographic effects that probably those species would have undergone when India collided?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't actually add that in. So there is a subfield of biogeography which is now called phylogeography, which is again nothing but getting genetic data from all of these species, putting them on a phylogenetic tree, and see if there is a geographic correspondence. Yeah, as she was saying, you could get samples of a species from one area and samples from another, and look at how different they are. So that is, in some sense, phylogeography or something like that. Yeah, but so it is possible to connect it with the geography. Yeah. Okay. And then there are different topographic features in India, and you can see that some of these, geographic features, these mountains, are really old. The Aravalis and Satpura and Eastern Ghats and all that. And here you'll notice that I've put Western Ghats and Himalayas. So Himalayas are really young. But globally, Andes is even younger. I mean, some of the higher elevations are just 2 or 3 million years old. The point here is that Western Ghats, although it's only 66 million years, you could say, well, that is for the topography. But the rocks, they are very old. They are about 2.4 giga GYA, I think, yeah. So that's because the rocks get uplifted. So the rocks are staying the same, but the topography is fairly recent. Yeah. Yeah, and this, this is just a map of diversity just based on NDVI and so on. And you can see where high diversity is. Not particularly relevant at this point, but yeah, I think it's just based on, it's a ISRO map. I mean, yeah, it looks like that. Yeah. Yeah. But what I want to talk to you a little bit more is about, yeah. I wouldn't read too much into it because it is really based on
curiosity I'm asking. The distribution of species diversity.
Yeah.
Just comparison to that of the Ghats, Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats.
Yeah.
Southern Western and Southern Eastern. So look at the diversity, it is very high in Western Ghats compared to Eastern Ghats, Southern Eastern Ghats. Can suggest for curiosity, I just ask because most of the climate conditions somewhat similar.
Yeah, but what are the key differences, you think, between Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats? Anybody else also could answer.
Rainfall.
It's drier. So maybe as we looked at that relationship between productivity and this thing, maybe that is one of the reasons. There is another reason, which is a little bit, you could say, a kind of a political reason, which is that there is less exploration of diversity in the Eastern Ghats. So it's probably not that there are less species, it's just that it is underexplored. So some of my colleagues have been putting together, the different surveys that have been conducted in the Eastern Ghats, and there are so few. But if you compare that to Western Ghats, there's a lot of different this thing. There's another thing is the topography. Eastern Ghats are not that high, so it doesn't have that topographic complexity. If you remember the niche, right? So there are not that many niche, you could say, there. So that could be another reason why. That is also possible. But Eastern Ghats, many parts of Eastern Ghats are still not that bad. We haven't lost. There are large parts of forests which are still intact. I mean, it's disturbed, but it's still there. Yeah. So quick kind of pivot to birds and looking at distributions of bird. So these are what you call disjunct distributions. So these strange distribution patterns that you see, some bird, this bird is here. The names of the species are not important. Sorry. The names of the species are not important, but you can see that there are these bizarre patterns, right? So can somebody tell me what do you see here? Are there any patterns that you can make out? Yeah, that's common across the species. These species, yeah, okay. And then the size of the bird problem. Yeah, okay. So now we are over interpreting. Just in terms of the maps. Yeah, go ahead.
First two maps show that the species are coming from Southeast Asia. And the second one, or the third one, would be connectivity for Malabar whistling thrush across Western Ghats and Central India, as well as for Indian babbler.
Yeah, so I agree that there is a Southeast Asian connection that you can see for these two species, and you don't see that here. But you can't actually assume where it came from, because I mean, for that you need other data that shows that directionality. Yeah, you remember that these are also the wet areas. The Southeast Asia, some parts of Orissa and the Western Ghats. See this? Yeah. So some of these patterns seem to follow this, and some go all the way across through the Satpuras, and sometimes they connect back here. So you can imagine that this is like, yeah, I mean, it's a different, different kinds of distributions. Yeah, please.
Is there also elevational thing? Because I mean, since you mentioned Satpura as well, so
yeah,
tend to kind of follow some bit of like a mountain.
Yeah, that's a good hypothesis as well. That maybe they are following the distribution patterns follow mountains, and this is exactly what biogeography is supposed to be about. So with mountains also comes climate. Like you get cooler climate, you get more rainfall sometimes. So the vegetation itself could be there. So it's difficult sometimes to tease these apart, like which of the factors, but it may be a combination of these factors. And that link to Himalayas, as Zeba was pointing out, that's there in different species. Like you see this yellow-throated martin that's found in the Himalayas, and Nilgiri martin is here. You can't see it very clearly in the south. So the sister species are distributed, one is there and another is here. And same way the Himalayan tar and the Nilgiri tar. Yeah, you can't see the map very clearly, but I think you know where they are. So what people have done is that, in the past, the natural history, people who were good naturalists, they have made these observations, just like you pointed out. Someone said, maybe they followed from Himalayas, they followed a mountain thread and they came, down to the Western Ghats. So let's quickly take a look at some of the different hypotheses that have been there. This one is a Satpura hypothesis, and it is exactly what you said, which is that they follow the mountains, especially the Satpura mountains. So you have the Himalayas, they follow the Satpura mountains for dispersal into the Western Ghats. And this was first suggested by Hora in 1953, who was looking at fishes, actually, the fish diversity. And later, Salim Ali, who's studying birds, reported this. And basically, it's still there. It's a very famous kind of a hypothesis in biogeography in India, but it's not really tested with molecular data. So Zeba was talking about the directionality. So no one has actually got molecular data and said that, yes, this is the pattern that you see in terms of genetic data. The other hypothesis is that, then someone looked at the same map and said, well, maybe they didn't come that way along the Satpuras, but they came along the Eastern Ghats, because that's also a significant mountain. It's closer to that Orissa belt where there is a, wet vegetation. And again, this is also untested. And then, of course, there's this third hypothesis, which is slightly different because it stresses on climate. So what they are saying is that there are these climatic refugia that could have been there in different areas, and basically species spread, and then when the climate kind of contracted the habitats into these refugia, they stayed there, and then from there they expanded further. So Praveen Karant and his group, they kind of pushed this idea a little bit forward. They said this probably was the moist habitats 18 to 11 million years, and then later as it dried up, it's probably become something like this. Yeah, so they used literature. There are no specific data for this, but they used literature of where vegetation was like what, and they made like a cartoon map for this. Yeah, sorry, I should have, yeah. So mid-Miocene, 18 to 11 million years, India was covered with wet forests. and then it became drier and so on. Yeah, and this is our research led by Pankaj in the lab. And what this shows is that we looked at these two species, the forest owlet and the spotted owlet. I should have put the photos, but actually the names don't matter. What matters is the ecology of the species. This is supposed to be more like a wooded habitat, for, as the name says, forest. And then the spotted owlet, which is an open habitat bird. Yeah, and you can see what you have here is years. So this is current distribution. You can see spotted owlet is found like in large areas, and forest owlet is found only in some parts there. And then we kind of projected the habitat back in time, and you can see that at some point these birds were found in much larger areas in the past. Yeah, here and then there. Yeah.
I mean, it took millions of years for it to go to different places. Wouldn't speciation occur? And they would have become, we would expect it to be different species by now, if we are talking about Paleocene eras and all.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So these two are different species. So let me, yeah, this one. Let's look at this, okay? So you have the Southeast Asian population here, and you have the Western Ghat population here. So one hypothesis is that they have been isolated for millions of years like this, in which case they may have been different. They are probably now different species. So if we have genetic data, we could check that. There's an alternate hypothesis that the vegetation is not static. Yeah, so climate was changing, and when the climate changes, the vegetation changes, which creates connectivity. So possibly, you know, the spider hunter was also, this bird was also found everywhere until 10,000 years or so. So in which case they may be the same species, just that they are isolated from each other. Yeah, so how will you know if it is this or that? Actually, you can't unless you have the genetic data to test that. Yeah.
Does the adding to a thing, so does the extinction also leads to the evolution of another species? I think, like the growth of another species. Extinction of one species may lead.
Yeah, I mean, this is deeper time, this thing, but what people say is that when dinosaurs went extinct, that is when the mammals actually, you know, they exploded. So yeah, it's all about opportunities and the niche being occupied by one versus the other. Mammals are thought to be mostly nocturnal, and only when the dinosaurs became extinct, more diurnality came in. So that is always going to be the cycle.
During the mass extinction events, also like we have seen one day species are went down and then the number has been increased.
Yeah, so that's possible completely. It depends on the niche and, you know, which species are able to colonize which areas. Yeah, sorry, you had a question for a while. We have not let the mic reach you.
About the that map with like the map that you showed, it's 300,000. No, the last map.
Yeah.
The last map that you showed. How do you measure that distribution? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a tricky thing. Someone talked about species distribution models yesterday. So what you do is you try to parameterize the current distribution of a species based on various climatic variables. Yeah, so you say that if temperature is above this, rainfall and so on, and if you have a good model, then you can look for, so that is a climate space that describes a climate space. Then you look for that climate space where it existed in different time points in the past. So you're projecting
fundamental niche, the one that Umesh said.
No, it's a good point. See, the problem is that it's difficult to say, right? because you're only getting the observations of species from where they are found now. So it may be an outcome of competition, in which case it's not fundamental niche, but that's what it is. Yeah, yeah.
So basically, in that sense, I'm assuming we are just trying to find those multiple other dimensions, the dimensional hypervolume that we spoke about.
Yeah, yeah.
And try to see what different climatic factors and vegetation, as well as all these things that we spoke about, elevation and all of that.
Yeah.
So in that case, could we also predict the future distribution of this species based on like predicted climatic condition? I'm thinking in a disease ecology framework where if we know where species are going to move to or going to get extinct from, would actually make a lot of relevance.
Yeah. So let's spend a few minutes on this. This is a really good thought, and people do that. We've also done that, but it's not here. There are two fundamental things in this. One is what he spoke about, which is about what kind of niche is it? And as you are you're stepping backward or forward in time, does this change? Right? Maybe your competitor is gone at another time. There was like an extinction of the competitor at some point or something like that. So in which case your outcome may differ. But there's also another point which is more logistical, one more point is that there is no adaptation. Yeah, you're assuming that the species actually stay same when you're making this prediction forward or backward. Another thing which is more logistical is that whatever your n-dimensional hypervolume, your variables that you have, you need those very variables for the other time points also. So if it's only temperature and rainfall, that's probably simpler because there are these global data sets that are available for the past and the lot of IPCC data predictions for the future. And for those future ones, you have different variations, right? Like the different scenarios are there. So yes, it is possible. That is the short answer. But the long answer is that it really depends on the specific, on the species, how well you know it, and the assumptions that you make behind that. You should be very clear about. Yeah.
I was just thinking about this species that I am working on right now called the Latidens salimali, the Salimali's fruit bat. So, I mean, when it comes to bats, especially the tolerance, their physiological tolerance when it comes to temperature, I mean, if you know what are the most limiting factor of the species, then you can account for example, keeping adaptation as constant and trying to see just the temperature and humidity, which is something that the IPCC, these models also predict, right?
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, I think in general, we must keep the understanding of the species is very important, but then knowing the limitations of what you're trying to do is equally important, especially in terms of, when you come to disease ecology, the problem is that you don't know some of these things well. So you're working with very, half data, but some models still work. That depends on how lucky you are in which species you ended up with. Yeah, okay. So, so this is the, this is another person, Ripley, who kind of identified various different barriers, 9 different barriers that are there. And he predicted some models of how species may differ. One of the things that happens, especially in birds and also in mammals, is that you have these things called subspecies. Yeah. So subspecies, I think, is where the traditional taxonomists said, well, it doesn't look like really a different species, so let's put it halfway there. And today, phylogeneticists don't actually believe in subspecies. They are like, it's either there or it's not. And then population geneticists have come taken the circle, all the way around, which is saying that there can be gene flow even in full species sometimes. So yeah, in any case, the point is that in some places, at some locations, species individuals look different, yeah, by plumage. And in birds, that has been what is used to kind of describe different subspecies. You can see the yellow tit and then the blackbird, yeah, the color patterns. And these can be kind of indicative of changes that are there, differences that are there between populations or species. Yeah. So Vivek Ramachandran, who worked with Uma at NCBS, and we worked on looking at subspecies and species boundaries. Remember what we talked about for how those range maps overlap and where there is a turnover? So what Vivek and I did was that we took, I don't remember how many species, but yeah, a few hundred species at least. And then at least all the birds of the peninsular India. And we looked at where the subspecies differ. And we noted down the location, the geographic location of where that boundary is. Just like the Wallace line. So for different species, that line is different. What we did was we kind of summarized those lines here. Yeah, so this one is the Palghat Gap, and there's one gap here, that's at Goa, and there's a little gap here. This is the Satpuras, that's the Chota Nagpur Plateau, and this I think is Godavari, and so on. Yeah, and that of course is the Park Strait. And when we did an analysis of which are the major areas, so basically you're looking now at numbers, where does turnover happen more? And we found that it's this Goa area and the Godavari and the Park Strait. These are the three main biogeographic barriers in peninsular India. Now this was a little bit of a surprise to us because Park Strait, of course, everybody knows this, right? I mean, it's a big biogeographic barrier, oceanic barrier, and there have been, when the water recedes, the land bridge shows up, and that's when Rama crosses and all that stuff, right? And then Godavari is a really wide river. So that's also imaginable, yeah, really wide river. There are, I think, yeah, there's a lot of data about how Godavari was even much larger. The Krishna Godavari area is actually very historically large. So that's also a physical barrier, understandable. But then you look at this Goa area, and there is no barrier actually. There's no real barrier there, but a lot of the birds are showing this subspecies difference. So then we started asking, why is that? How is that a barrier at all? And it turns out that that is a climatic barrier. So the climate is very different north of Goa compared to the south of Goa. And recently there's someone who studied Draco, the flying lizard, Draco. And they found that Draco is actually not found north of Goa. It's only found south of Goa. And his hypothesis is that the overall tree height north of Goa is lower than south of Goa. So because they need, tall trees to climb up and then glide, they hypothesize that that is a limiting factor for this species north of Goa. So that's really fascinating, right? I mean, basically, species are found in one area and not in the other, but the reason for why a species is not found can be actually depending on the ecology of the species. It can be temperature, it can be habitat, or it can be something that is completely, a product of something else, like this height of the trees. All right. And the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are really fascinating as well. You have all of these islands, and there were lot of hypotheses about how species got here, whether they came from Burma, whether they came from India. So this is Ripley and Beeler who analyzed the birds of this area, and he tried to see which direction is similarity more. And it turns out that there are shared species with all the directions. Yeah, so supposedly like this answer can come only when you have genetic data from all of these areas, and then you can probably tell a little bit more. So in terms of understanding modern biogeography, this is a review that was done by Biswas and Karant. And what they said is that there's very little studies. Most of the studies are in southern Western Ghats, which is all of this. And then there are very few studies from other parts of Western Ghats and very few from rest of India. That is actually changing quite a bit now. I'll just give you a few examples. One of it is the centipede. Janvi Joshi is kind of, oh yeah, she's coming tomorrow, right? Oh, today, okay. Yeah, she's speaking tomorrow, so I won't tell you more about this, but the divergence of centipedes actually coincides with continental drift. So these are really very old species in that sense. And another really seminal work is on frogs in the Western Ghats, and this is by Vijay Kumar, SP Vijay Kumar, when he was working in Karthik's lab. And what they did is this fantastic sampling all across the Western Ghats, and they find various patterns in these bush frogs of diversification. And here, because there are a number of species, it's not just that they differ across the Palghat Gap, but also within the gap, I mean, within one of the areas, like in the Shola habitat, there are switches from forest to grassland, from grassland to forest. So there are these lineages, which are predominantly forest lineages, and there's a switch, there's a grassland frog that arose from that. So this is possible only, I mean, you get to see this because there are so many species. In birds, there aren't as many species. So you don't see all of these, the evolutionary opportunity is a bit limited. Yeah? And this is Deepak's work on lizards of peninsular India. They talk about the role of aridification, how semi-arid habitats, there's a coincidence with C4 grass. C4 grasses are those that are linked to dry habitats. Yeah. So, yeah, I think birds of Western Ghats, I am not really talking much about this, but I'll summarize this. This is work that I did in Uma's lab. This is the cross-section of Western Ghats going from the south to the north. You have Shenkota Gap, Palghat Gap, Chaliar Valley, and this is elevation on the y-axis. So you see the highest mountains here. What we tried to do was sample for a set of birds across all of the different parts of this Western Ghats. And what we find is that a lot of species were actually separated at the Palghat Gap. Yeah, 10 of the 24 species that we looked at. And then some at the Shenkota Gap and the rest at the Chaliar Valley. So this is interesting because it's a lot like that Wallace line thing that we were talking about. You were asking why is there a divergence that's happening? Why are there different species very close by? So this distance is just 40 kilometers. The distance at Shenkota Gap is just 10 kilometers. But the divergence of these birds is about 5 million years of these Sholicola and the laughing thrushes. And at this 10 kilometer, it's about 2 million years. So that's a really long time, and the distance is less. And the reason for that is a combination of ecology and climate. So species that are very tightly tied to these wet and cold habitats of the mountain tops, they won't just fly across the mountain. They fly, clamped to terrain, as I say, like if you do Google Earth, you can just fly. If you do a fly through, you can go straight, or you can do clamp to terrain, which would just go wherever the mountain goes, right? So that's how they fly. So, but they can't do climb to terrain flight because when you go down that hill, you reach very dry habitat. So essentially you can say that they're waiting for the habitat to connect. And that only happens when the climate changes. The climate moves the habitat up and down. Yeah. So a lot of the divergences that you will see will be linked to it would be kind of synchronous with the climatic changes. Yeah. Yeah, genetic break means, suppose you have DNA sequence of 1,000 base pairs or something, and then DNA sequence from this side, they are just different. That's all that it means. If you create a phylogenetic tree, they fall apart in two different clades. Yeah? Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the dotted lines basically? So is it like less connective?
Yeah. So that's why we didn't have samples. Yeah. Yeah. So for 2 species, we didn't have samples from here, but yeah. I don't know if we know any better now. I forget. Yeah. I think. Yeah. I don't know. I don't recollect. Yeah. All right. Just a little bit more. I know it's kind of getting long. Yeah.
So what may be the reason that for Palghat Ghat to be that a major barrier for the gene flow? Is there any strange or variations compared, because it flows through the Western Ghats, right?
Yeah. So there are 2 things. One is which species we are talking about. Yeah. So some species can fly across the Palghat gap. Yeah. So those are, in our set of 24 species, 14 species were able to do that. They fly across the Western Ghats. There's a lot of dispersal movement across. So genetically they're similar. Yeah. But for 10 species, they are not similar. They show these phylogenetic divergence. And we think it is because of their ecology, about how tied they are to a specific climate. And that climate, that climatic zone, that that n-dimensional hypervolume, if those are separated, then you see the divergence. So it's not by geographic distance, but it's more by climatic distance. I mean, the distance between similar climate. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, just. Okay.
So I'm assuming Palghat Gap is as old as Western Ghats?
Yeah. It's a technical question because remember I was saying that Palghat Gap is formed by these uplifts. Yeah. So Palghat Gap happens to be a shear zone, which means that there is a crack in the plate. And that crack actually runs across from Madagascar to Antarctica. So when they were together in Pangaea. So now imagine that if you have a cracked plate and there is an uplift, so basically where the crack is, it doesn't get lifted up. Yeah. So both sides of the plate got lifted up, the crack remained. So now how old is the Palghat Gap is a tricky question. What I would say is that it's older than the birds, because it depends on which uplift you're talking about. So it's been there for 50 million years at least. And modern birds came in, I think, 20 million or so. I don't remember the number. Yeah.
Climatic distance would make.
That's the working hypothesis. But again, it depends on the ecology of the species. Huh? As you saw in the case of the frogs, I mean, they are more ecologically tied to narrow niches. So there's even more speciation and this thing happening in that. So that the divergences there are also 5 million years, strangely, for many of them, because it's the same climate, right? Climate is the same thing that's happening. But the origins of these species are much older. Yeah.
There is no species in Palghat Gap because why?
No, actually there are species in Palghat Gap. Just that these 10 species are not found
you want
there.
to see the barrier.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. You can go ahead and then.
Yeah, continuing the same thing which you were speaking about frogs.
Yeah.
There are some within the biogeographic region. There are some small pockets where there is intensely high biodiversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have, as you said, very similar characters. So, what could have led? One example could be Coorg, which has immense diversity.
Sorry, one could be.
Kodagu.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
They have immense diversity, and the surrounding regions are very similar to it in terms of vegetation also.
Yeah, actually, you see, like a lot of this depends on the kind of species and overall what it relates to, what it connects to. So, if you're looking at species high species diversity, some of these mountain tops don't have high species diversity, but they have few but specialized species. Some areas have high species diversity, and there are some reasons for that. Did Umesh talk about mid-domain effect yesterday? Okay. So essentially, remember we're talking about niche and how there are species with certain niche. And in areas where different kinds of niches overlap, right, there is where you find more diversity. So mid elevations in the Western Ghats are known to have higher diversity. So if you go lower down, you'll find a lot of generalist birds found everywhere. You go high up, you find specialist birds found nowhere else when you come down. But you go in between, you'll get both. So you may find more species. Yeah, so these are just general principles. But of course, if you're looking at coastal habitats, marine habitats, there this thing is very different. It depends on nutrient flow. It may depend on the shelf depth. So it just really depends on the species, that we are talking about. Aquatic species depend on the number of streams and orders of streams sometimes. There's a lot of parameters that would come into play. Yeah.
As I was just talking about Palghat Ghat.
Yeah.
So you said about the species variations where only the particular species may cross that things.
Yeah.
Is it due to that what we call a genetic drift, nothing but like a founder effect or bottleneck effect? So that it may, because as you mentioned, what is the age of that Palghat? Is it similar to the Western Ghats? Like that, is there any chances that it may have been happen like that?
Like what exactly? Sorry.
Means that genetic drift, is that happened in this case or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, for others' sake, basically what I think he's trying to get at is what is the mechanism of this speciation. And when we published this paper, we thought a lot about this because here you see these mountains, right? And there are different species found on these mountains. And to us, it looks like a radiation. And radiation in evolutionary, radiation is when there is one, from one branch, there are many nodes that come out, right? So this looked like that. And then immediately, if there is a bird radiation, the first thing that people think about is Darwin's finches. But the important difference is that is an adaptive radiation. I think everybody knows the story from school, right? Different food that it eats and beak shape and size and so on. But this, at least to our knowledge as of now, it seems like a non-adaptive radiation. So we think it is drift, like you said, which means that they just got isolated, this vicariance process. Species are found everywhere. Suddenly there is a break, they get separated, and like genetic drift happens, which is just, random change over long periods of time. Yeah, this one we used Sanger sequence data, but more recently we've used next-gen DDRAD and things like that. So more or less, first, when I started working first with the species, I did only this species, and I think I had, 1,000 base pairs or something like that, Sanger sequencing data, and later we had a few thousands, and it's basically, it stays.
What we are sequencing there?
Sorry?
Which part?
Cytochrome B was what I started with, and then added more mitochondrial and nuclear data. And then with DDRAD, you get kind of a whole genome representation. The thing is that as you increase data, sometimes you get more resolution, which means that with DDRAD, maybe some of these birds which we think are connected may not be connected. But it's very unusual for species that show like 5 million year divergence to not show divergence with more data. I mean, that can happen if there is some, if there's some sex biased thing or something like that, but not here. Sorry? Isolation, yes. So she's asking if I've also looked at isolation by distance. Yes, those patterns happen, especially within the mountain. I'll talk a little bit about that later in the evening. Yeah, I'll skip this and just very quickly, what we've been also doing is trying to link species distributions with historic distribution. Remember, we did this where we were looking at forest owlet and species, how they contract and expand. There are these methods to look at historic population contraction. And at the moment, I'll just end by saying that the genetic data seems to corroborate. Yeah.
Which method, PSMC?
Yeah,
or
PSMC.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, you're already. Yeah, it takes a little longer to go through that, but yeah, I'll just summarize quickly. Basically, there's a lot of biogeography is very interesting field because, I mean, especially for people who are like me, motivated by natural history, to look at patterns that are there, try and describe it, and then look at some mechanisms why that may be found. So it's often a starting point. It also can be useful when you're looking at trying to describe diversity of a particular area. So I would think that specifically when looking at disease and things like that, definitely biogeography is something that should stay in your minds because species don't just originate randomly. There are certain patterns that are there, and they may follow general biodiversity patterns as well. So yeah, with that, I'll end. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, there is a website called yes, yeah. I'll type that in and then I'll show you. Yeah. Oh, you just want to see it now? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So it's supposed to be the fastest movement, longest and fastest, I think. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
If we see this Indian plate in the previous animation, actually it moved little faster and quite a longer distance as compared to that of other parts. Why is that?
I don't know the answer. I mean, I'm already stepping into geology quite a bit. So.
Yeah, I think the plate tectonics is what drove all this movement. Why it moved faster, I don't know.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah, that's a pattern, but I don't know the cause for that pattern.
But I mean, I think what is really interesting, well, I mean, there are people have worked on this for many, many years. So
no, Madagascar is smaller. There are many other smallers. It's not just that.
Yeah.
That's the geology workshop soon at ICTS. Sign up for that.
But I just wanted to emphasize that, on the first day, we talked about patterns and process, right? And yesterday, we actually talked a lot about how will you even estimate these things. And almost like I liked when Robin started today, started talking about natural history and looking for things and then trying to explain them. Versus yesterday, almost if you're thinking about, you should assume you know nothing. Even the plot should be selected randomly. So not that is bad or this is bad or anything like that, but it's just that there are different frameworks that we have to work in when we're looking at different types of data. But thanks so much, Robin, and take a break. Yeah.